what are you doing discussing sensitive plans with people just because you want to be piled up with them and you want to gossip like you're hanging out in the pub on a Friday night?
Hi, I'm Fergus Macphee and welcome to Times Radio's Trump Report. Today, once again, we're speaking to Scott Lucas, Professor of International Politics at the Clinton Institute in the University College Dublin. Scott, thank you once again for joining us on the Trump Report.
Thanks to you, Fergus, and all those great viewers out there in Times Radio world.
Now, we have a lot to get into today, but I think there's only one place to start, and we'll start with the chaos at the Pentagon and the question of, has it happened again? Over the weekend, US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth was linked to another group chat about military operations on the Signal messaging app. It's reported he even shared this with his wife, brother, and personal lawyer. Now, the word I use, Scott, is chaos. What word would you use to describe this?
What was the old Oscar Wilde statement? The first time it happens, it's unfortunate. The second time it happens, good Lord. I mean, Pistol Pete Hegseth here. You're already been, so the original Signal Gate, if we can just remind people what happens is, he's there with other government advisors in a Signal group discussing attack plans for U.S. operations against Yemen. These are bombing runs that took place in March against the Houthi insurgency. The people who were involved in it were National Security Council staff from the Central Intelligence Agency, staff from the State Department, as well as the Department of Defense. Now, it's bad enough to be talking to other government staff about attack plans on a channel which is a private corporate channel. You are not there. You're not authorized to discuss classified information on any private channel. And attack plans, and let's just get this out of the way. The Trump administration is absolutely lying through its teeth. Attack plans are classified information. Ask any military person out there, it will be. What happens over the weekend is we find out that Hegseth is on a second Signal group at the same time, but this is a family and friends group. These aren't even government advisors here necessarily. It's just like folks he hangs out with and his wife. What are you doing discussing sensitive plans with people just because you want to be piled up with them and you want to gossip like you're hanging out in the pub on a Friday night? What's interesting, Fergus, though, is to get to the layers around this story. Okay, first of all, this is part of a complete meltdown at the Pentagon, which is taking place in that there are 4 senior staff who have either been fired or transferred in recent days. They include Hegseth's chief of staff, his deputy chief of staff, and 2 other senior advisors. There's almost no senior official left in Hegseth's office. Now, why are those people being fired or terminated? In other words, there's infighting going on with different factions who are fighting against each other. Is this part of Hegseth purging people, or is it that there are others who want to be rid of Hegseth? And then you have this complete meltdown at the Pentagon, accompanied with, by the way, to add another layer to it, an attempt by Trump officials and Elon Musk to purge the Department of Defense of hundreds, maybe thousands of staff, simply because they only want Trump loyalists there. And so what you have is that the tip of the iceberg is whether Pete Hegseth is there. The broader and more serious issue is whether American national security is compromised because the Pentagon itself is in disarray.
Well, you talk about this disarray and this sort of full-blown meltdown, it's been called. And this comes with now there's reports of officials going into the Pentagon having to take a lie detector test to ensure that they're not leaking sensitive information to the media. I mean, if you need to take a lie detector test for someone to be leaking classified information from the Department of Defense, that implies something is just seriously rotten, doesn't it?
It's seriously rotten, but again, break down on how rotten this is. The allegations of lie detector tests are coming from people who were supporting the firing of 3 of Hegseth's aides, right? In other words, they're trying to protect Hegseth and protect Trump by saying, look, these guys had to take lie detector tests. Well, why do they have to take lie detector tests? This is where the story gets iffy, right? the allegations there, for example, that there were leaks regarding American threats against the Panama Canal. Well, that raises the issue of why is the United States making threats against Panama? But then the more interesting one is they had to take a lie detector test because someone leaked to the media that there were sensitive issues regarding China that had been discussed with Elon Musk, which raises the question of why are you discussing sensitive issues regarding the Department of Defense in China with Elon Musk when Elon Musk has business interest in China? So in other words, even the story that these guys are taking lie detector tests are part of, again, this breakdown of what should be effective standard operating procedure regarding security that takes place. Now, let me just take the level one step further. So these three guys get dismissed. The deputy chief of staff, two others, they're chucked out because they supposedly have been leaking to the press. They say they haven't even taken a lie detector test. They say that this, in fact, is a stitch up and that the whole idea of leaks to the media are being used as the cover because someone's out to get them. Then the chief of staff, Joe Casper, is transferred, and he publicly blasts the three who have already been fired, as well as Hegseth. He says everyone's letting down Donald Trump, right? So was it Joe Casper who fired these three people, and then someone else goes after Joe Casper? In other words, I don't want to minimize the threat that Pete Hegseth is to national security. And that is a serious threat. But as always, go to the wider story here. The Trump administration is a threat to national security because it cannot run the Pentagon effectively. And its interest is not in running the Pentagon effectively. Its interest was in going in and ripping up the Pentagon on the idea, well, one, that supposedly the Pentagon was too woke. But two, here's the real story, Fergus. Donald Trump has had it in for the U.S. military for years. And let's go back to this. In his first term, he had competent people who were in at the Department of Defense, but he fell out with them. He fell out with James Mattis, who is a four-star general, former commander of the Marine Corps, because Mattis stood up to him and said, look, there are certain issues here where you really need to be careful in how you're proceeding, whether it was withdrawal from Syria, whether it was over what happened in Afghanistan. Then he fired H.R. McMaster, who was another general, who was the National Security Council head, the National Security Advisor, and he eventually fell out with his chief of staff, another general named John Kelly. So he blames all of those military for letting him down, but most significantly, he blames the military for not helping him when he tried to hold on to office on January 6th, 2021, during the attack on the Capitol, especially blaming General Mark Milley, who was head of Joint Chiefs of Staff, because he wouldn't come out and deploy the military in support of Trump on that day. So Trump doesn't actually like the military who were there. And the idea was, we're going to replace all these guys who aren't really in with me. They don't support me. We're going to get more compliant military staff. And Hegseth was going to be the guy to do it. Problem is, Hegseth's incompetent. So what do you have as a result of all of this? You have a military which is being undermined by the administration, where the guy is head of the Pentagon, who is part of the problem and definitely not part of the solution.
Okay, well, in that case, can you see him getting rid of Hegseth himself? At the moment, Donald Trump sort of says these allegations are a waste of time, and it doesn't really seem like he's taking it that seriously. But surely in any other administration, Hegseth would have lost his job by now.
I think the reason why Hegseth has not lost his job is just simply trying to save face. We're less than 3 months into the Trump administration. A lot of people said, and by a lot of people, I actually mean some Republicans, as well as the standard critics, who said, no, you've got an issue here. He shouldn't have been hired in the first place. Well, if you chuck him after 3 months, it's like, oh yeah, we screwed up. We did it wrong. The standard play here would be, look, give us another 3 months and try to get him out when things have quieted down, and then you replace him. But there's a complication here. Is who do you replace Hegseth with? I mean, good Lord. I mean, the fact of the matter is that, Trump's not going to bring the adults in the room back in to head up the Pentagon. So which other TV reality star is he going to bring? Which other person with baggage is going to come in and basically be another arsonist brought into the fire? So I think, if I was reading this as a normal administration, and you know how it works in Whitehall, right? Scandal erupts. You just sort of say, all right, the card is marked, but we're just going to do this on a Friday a few weeks from now. that's the way you would do it. But this is not a standard administration. So Hegseth could go soon, especially if there's a rebellion on Capitol Hill amongst Republican legislators, or he could hang on for months just simply because the Trump administration digs its heels in and decides that, you get this. And he is a Trump loyalist, since he's a Trump loyalist, that he could wind up basically burning the whole place to ashes, and he still would be there with King Donald saying, well, he's my guy.
You talked about Republicans there. I actually wanted to ask, is there any disquiet among Republican lawmakers? I mean, what are they making about all this?
So the first Republican lawmaker to come out and call for Hegseth to go is a representative named Don Bacon, who made the statement on Monday night. But Don Bacon has been a critic of the Trump administration before on national security issues. So, it's kind of like, okay, that's kind of expected. And I think there may be a couple of others. I'd keep an eye on a very prominent Republican senator named Roger Wicker, again, because he's a chair of one of the national security committees. He may come out and say Hegseth needs to go. You really need to have more than the 2 or 3, standard folks making the statement. I'd say if we get maybe, 6, 8, 10 top legislators who start to make the call, then I think there's something which is serious afoot.
Do you think that's likely?
Not yet. And again, I'm trying to read this in different ways. And part of it is you read what happens in the mainstream press and who's leaking and who's coming out there. Part of it is you read the standard Trump outlets. Fox TV this morning wasn't even talking about the Hegseth case. They were talking about the fact that a base commander has been canned in a fit of spite because apparently the base didn't have photos of Trump and Hegseth up there, welcoming people to happy MAGA land. So, that's the way the loyalists are still playing it. What I'm really interested in is not whether Hegseth stays or go immediately. It's really what's happening with the rank and file, with the military folks. The U.S. military, is part of the code. You don't come out, you don't get political, you don't come out and trash your commander or chief and so on. But there's got to be a hell of a lot of disquiet amongst military folks. I think the more that serving military officers are going quietly to folks in Washington and beyond and say, look, we really are in an intolerable situation, then you'll see the pressure start to build on Hegseth, and you will start to see the symptoms of it come out from some legislators, from some outlets that will be conservative outlets. But part of the reason why you get Hegseth saved at this point is because the news cycle is going to move on to some other screw up within the next day or two. So, we'll talk about a couple of them in a minute, but Pete Hegseth might get saved because Donald Trump has decided he's going to try to fire the head of the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell, and send America into full-blown economic crisis. So Pete gets to watch everything burn, but he's not the guy who takes the fall for it.
I feel like you've set us up brilliantly there for a segue, Scott, because you talked about another screw-up, and I'm afraid this isn't the only national security issue we're going to talk about. It gets worse as Kristi Noem, the US Homeland Security Secretary, has had her handbag stolen from a burger restaurant in Washington. Now, inside was $3,000, but also an ID card that gave her access to secure buildings. I guess my question is, how worried should American citizens be about national security?
Look, if we were talking about, again, a sensible country or even a not so sensible country like my longtime homeland of the UK, this would be page 1 news for, and it's like, oh my God, it's a scandal. Westminster MP or cabinet officer, caught, leaving something behind in a restaurant or getting it nicked. But because there's so much that's going, pear-shaped in the States, I think this is a here today, gone tomorrow story. Now, we'll touch on it for a minute. This is why it's going to get some play is not that I think there's an imminent security threat. There were questions about how a thief could get to a restaurant table and get Kristi Noem's bag when she is, the Homeland Security secretary. Where's her own personal security at this point? But I think in part, this is because Kristi Noem, let's give context for this, really wanted to be vice president, was this Trumpist governor of South Dakota who bragged about the fact that she would basically send everyone to prison. And then she went a little bit too far because she published or had a ghostwritten memoir in which she bragged about shooting her. I think it was shooting her dog, right? She shot her dog because it wasn't tough enough. And everybody was so upset that she'd crossed the line about shooting her dog. She couldn't get to be vice president. And instead, it was JD. And she winds up being Homeland Security Secretary as a consolation prize. Well, her latest exploit a few days ago was to go down to the mass detention center, the prison in El Salvador, where the Trump folks are trying to disappear migrants, and posing in front of it, waving a gun, right? Basically a throwback. And I'm just going to put this out there. 20 years ago, this was the type of pose that people were striking at Abu Ghraib in Iraq in another scandal. Well, now it's completely normal for Kristi Noem as Homeland Security Secretary and others to pose with weapons like, isn't it great we're disappearing folks? So I think that's a bit why it was the flutter, that folks who are anti-Trumpist, who don't like Trump, could say, look, they talk about security and it bit them in the backside here. I'm not a big fan of them, as you can tell, but I think this is a story where we give it a little bit of chit chat, and then we're on to more serious matters.
Well, it's one we'll definitely keep an eye on in the coming days. But I want to move on to something that I know that you are personally quite passionate about, and this is the president at war with universities at the moment. And this has come to a head because Harvard is suing the Trump administration over a $2.2 billion funding freeze. Can you explain sort of what's going on for people who might not know, and why would the administration want to directly damage its oldest, most prestigious, and arguably best university?
Let's start with the immediate case and work wider. But I'm going to give you the takeaway up front. Spoiler alert. When a government wants to move towards authoritarian rule, what they do is they try to break checks on their power. They try to break the courts. And we can talk about that in relation to cases such as the disappearance of the migrants. They try to break the media, and we can talk about Trump trying to do this for years. They try to break agencies in terms of getting rid of their autonomy, which is happening right now. They try to break legal firms, which they're trying to do right now. And they try to break universities because universities are supposed to, in a system that operates effectively, provide independence of thought. They're supposed to be autonomous. They may wind up criticizing the administration. They may wind up criticizing the government, but that's part of what makes for a free and effective system. So the takeaway here is that we're not in a case of a wannabe autocracy. They're there. The Trump folks are there. They are authoritarian. So they're going to go after the universities. And this was flagged in Project 2025, as well as a lot of the other things that we're discussing. This was laid out. It was an open secret that they were going to go after the universities. They were going to use the pretext, and it is a pretext, that universities are woke. It's a pretext because the guys who say woke usually don't even know what woke means. It was the pretext of DEI, as if diversity and equity and inclusion are bad things. But the universities that you're really going to go after, you're going to go after Ivy League universities, because they're like, they're the brand leader in the United States. Now you're going to go after them for certain reasons. Again, as I drill in on Harvard, part of it's going to be because of the Israel-Gaza issue. And let's call it what it is. After Hamas's mass killing on October 7th, 2023, 18 months of Israeli mass killing in Gaza. And there are people who protested that. And there are people who protested that who are also favor a state of Palestine. Some of those demonstrations, and Harvard is one of the universities that investigated this, some of these demonstrations were accused of blocking access to university facilities. At Columbia, there was an occupation of a university building for a time. There were Jewish students who reported feeling harassed or intimidated or threatened in this atmosphere. Those cases were investigated as well. What happens is that the Trump administration whips this up into the idea that there is a pervasive, systematic anti-Semitism at universities And so you have to come in and take control of the universities. So that's one layer of what they're trying to do with Harvard as a pretext. There's another layer, which is the idea that this is leftist, radical ideas that are irresponsible. So we have to come in and take them in. And there's another layer that they will not admit to, which is Donald Trump resents Ivy League universities. Donald Trump's actually a graduate from an Ivy League university, from the Wharton Business School at University of Pennsylvania. But he's been caught out because when he graduated in the late 60s, so he claims that when he graduated in the late 60s, he was first in his class, and he wasn't. In fact, one of his professors at the University of Pennsylvania said he was the dumbest damn student he'd ever taught. Trump resents that. He resents the fact that people don't look upon him as being a genius. And so he goes after the Ivy League universities, Harvard, Columbia, Brown, Princeton, Dartmouth. The starting point is you freeze Harvard's funding, government funding. They start with the $2.2 billion that they've stripped away immediately. They're threatening to take away another billion as I speak to you. There's $9 billion that could go. Now, Harvard can take that financial blow. They'll have to cover it from private endowments. They cover financial blow. What's more worrying is that the reason why they've cut the funding is because Harvard would not cave to the Trump administration's demands that the Trump administration effectively would tell Harvard it would have a veto over Harvard students, a veto over Harvard's faculty members, a veto over Harvard's curriculum, a veto over Harvard's admissions process. They wanted to take control of Harvard. They did this same thing with Columbia. And in Columbia's case, it was $400 million of funding that they threatened to withhold. Columbia immediately compromised and gave way on some of their demands. Those talks are ongoing. Harvard drew the line and said, no, we're not going to give ground because you'll just want to come back and take more from us. They are being supported by other universities, notably Stanford, which is one of the best known U.S. universities on the West Coast. They're getting support from Yale University members, faculty members at Yale. We're waiting to see what Yale's administration does. What you have here is, and I just must emphasize this again, is that under the pretext of woke DEI anti-Semitism, you have a systematic effort by an administration to take control of America's top universities, and they will try to do it with other universities across the country. Indeed, something that I think a lot of the media didn't miss, this already happened at the state level down in Florida. That Ron DeSantis, when he wanted to be president, went after the universities there. He replaced members of the boards of trustees at certain Florida universities. He forced changes in curricula. He tried to take control of admissions processes down at those universities. And Florida's got a compromised higher education system because of this. Well, this is now happening at national level. And again, it is one aspect of what is a much wider drive for authoritarian rule. Remember that the threat on universities was already happening as well over the past few months in terms of that research funding was being slashed as Elon Musk went through and ripped up the US government. So almost all American scientific research is in danger of being frozen or sharply cut. The National Institutes for Scientific Research, the National Institutes for Research in the Humanities have been effectively gutted. That US research in collaboration with foreign partners has been effectively suspended or undermined. And foreign academics are being caught up in this because some of them are not being allowed into the United States. And let me give you a breaker on this. Now, I have to be careful what I say because I don't want to get anybody in trouble here, but I know because I got it in the last few days that at a prominent UK university on several separate occasions, they had scholars who were stopped at the US border and were interrogated, and their phones were taken off of them. This department is not a security sensitive department. It's a department in the arts and humanities. There was no security reason to stop these academics. This university is now advising its staff to take burner phones into the United States.
I was going to ask you about this because you did a post on X about it. I mean, if if what you say is true, that almost sounds like modern day McCarthyism.
Yeah. Oh God, it is. Let's be honest with you. Look, when I was much younger, but some folks may remember and so on. And I used to have to go. I lived in the UK since the '80s, and I'd go back in, and you have that questionnaire: Are you now, or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? And I can safely say no, despite what some of our detractors on YouTube say. And and I can get into the country. Okay, fine. That's a legacy of going back to the Cold War and pick up all of this. I never had an incident, however, where I thought, look, if I go in, they're going to lift my phone off of me. Now, you know, not just academics, but lawyers, students, just tourists in general have got to make the call, which is, look, if I've got an immigration officer who's having a bad day, let alone someone who's looked at my social media post, am I going to be stopped, held up for hours, possibly even detained? And by the way, I've got to emphasize, there are now cases coming through where it's U.S. citizens who've been detained as well. I have to emphasize individual cases. It's not systematic yet, but it's happening. So I'm just going to come out and say it's going to be interesting to see what happens. I've got to go to the States. I'm going to the States to visit my mother for Mother's Day, right? It's supposed to be a surprise, but sorry, she doesn't watch Times Radio, so we're cool. So I've got to go back. And, I've got to think, am I actually going to go through the process of leaving behind the phones and taking in a burner phone? Because even though I'm a U.S. citizen, I'm going to get picked up because I'm talking to you on the Times report and I say things that aren't nice about Pete Hegseth. And I have to emphasize this. I don't want to overblow it for folks. I don't want to overblow it in terms of saying, oh my gosh, that's it. It's like everybody is in danger of being disappeared in El Salvador. But I honestly have to say I'm unsettled by this. I'm unsettled by the fact that, as you can tell, I've got a deep attachment, having been born and raised in this country, that even though if I disagree with the government, even though if I disagree with the policies of it, that I still think some of the values that it espouses, even if it doesn't live up to them, are values that I think should be good. And here am I saying that the fundamentals of being able to enter the country are now in question, in jeopardy, in a way that we have not had since, as you put it, the 1950s and the era of McCarthyism.
Final question on the universities. You obviously work for a university yourself. If, say, these sort of cuts do go through, what kind of direct impact would that have? Would you see lots of students and scholars, do you think, leaving the US?
There are European universities who are advertising for American scholars to come to them. I know of one French university that is already doing that, because I was talking to colleagues the other day. There are other universities who may not be advertising, but they're letting it be known on social networks that they're very open for U.S. scholars to come to them. There are some universities that may be considering financial incentives for those U.S.-based scholars to come across. Because remember, of course, we're talking about, in some cases, those would be U.S. citizens that you might try to attract. In a lot of cases, it's foreign scholars who have been part of U.S. universities, in some cases for many years. One of the reasons why the U.S. university sector has been so dynamic is because it's very international in scope. People from around the world go there to pursue their research and to pursue their scholarship. Well, now it's like, is this really a place that wants to be? And I'm going to use a really provocative historical example, because you might as well be provocative of this. We are not at the scale of this case I'm going to give you yet, but if you want to think about it, back in the 1930s, Germany had some of the most eminent researchers and scholars in the world. They had some eminent writers like Thomas Mann, for example. They had eminent scientists. There's a fellow named Eisenstein, for example. That's the Soviet filmmaker. Einstein, who they left. In fact, America, as you know, in part, its ability to create the nuclear bomb and other research developments in World War II was because of the foreign scientists who'd come across in the 1930s. America benefited from Nazi Germany overreaching in that horrible purge of German society, including the killing eventually of millions of people. Now, here we are in the US in 2025 under a Trump authoritarian rule, or at least one which aspires to be authoritarian. Now, what would the effect of that be on researchers, whether it's in the sciences, engineering, whether it's be in high tech, whether it be in AI, whether it be in the arts and humanities. And the irony here is that as you have Elon Musk going around saying, look at me, I'm this paragon of what will be. I am the great future here and on Mars, that the US government is absolutely cutting away the expertise that is there. So Elon wins a small battle in that they maintain visas, what are called the H-1B visas, for foreign tech sector workers to come across the United States. He wins that battle, but they lose the war. They lose the war for thoughts and ideas, because at the end of the day, an autocracy does not value independence of thought.
Scott, we could talk about this all day, but I'm afraid I'm going to have to leave you with one last question. Last time you were on the Trump Report, I believe the words you used to describe the president was economic moron. Well, today the US markets are still in turmoil, and the price of gold has just hit a record high. So I guess some might say you were right in the last week.
And let me give you the serious story that we're going to hand this to. First of all, he's still an economic moron. There, have a pop at me on YouTube. And by the way, if you say he made billions of dollars and I didn't, he didn't make billions of dollars by being a great investor and so on. He got daddy's money and he's been playing at his own Trump casino for decades. Now have a go at me with that. Now let's get serious. The tariffs, the uncertainty around the tariffs roll on. Remember that there are still tariffs on everybody of at least 10%. There's 145% on China. That all this talk that they're going to reach trade deals with the UK and with India, that's the latest wheeze and so on, that to reach a trade deal quite often takes months and even years. So that's sort of the wheeze that's out there. But here's the serious thing that has happened this week, and that is that Donald Trump has threatened to fire the head of the Federal Reserve, a man named Jerome Powell. Now, for those who don't know, the Federal Reserve is the independent, effectively institution for fiscal and monetary policy in the United States. It is similar to the UK establishing an independent Bank of England. Jerome Powell cannot be fired by the president. He has an 8-year term until 2026. If Donald Trump was to try to basically, without the authority, fire Jerome Powell, he would send stock markets into a tailspin. He would further erode confidence in U.S. bonds, which are needed to finance government debt, and he would further erode the U.S. dollar. Because he simply threatened to fire Powell yesterday, stock markets went down between 2 and 3% in the United States. But more importantly, bond markets were sent into a further spiral with people trying to sell off U.S. bonds, and the dollar is now reaching historic lows. I think it is now at a 50-year low in terms of the rate of drop versus the UK pound. It's still much higher than it has been in the past against the UK pound, but it's dropping quicker at a quicker rate than it has at any point in the last 50 years. It is now at a serious low versus international currencies that it has not reached in years. And I'll leave you with this. April will be the worst month on the US stock market at this rate since the Great Depression. It'll be the worst month since 1932. So yeah, folks, beyond the phrase economic moron, here's the reality. The first people who get hurt by Trump's inability to comprehend basic economics and his desire for personal power and profit are Americans. They are manufacturers, they are farmers, they are business people, they are consumers. But then the rest of us get hit as well. No one is unscathed.
Well, Scott, we'll be watching that closely, and I don't think that'll be the last time we speak. Maybe we'll catch up again at the end of the month. Scott Lucas, thank you so much for joining us on the Trump Report today.
Stay safe, stay sane.